Welcome. I'm Brandy Bynum Dawson, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the North Carolina Rural Center.
And I'm Bronwyn Lucas, Senior Director of Leadership and Engagement.
We're excited today to bring to you a special message just for our Rural Counts, the Small Business Coalition, and leadership alumni tuning in today about the latest and greatest on the state budget and what it means for our communities and all of rural North Carolina.
We'd like to thank the sponsors of this webinar series, Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina Foundation, and all of our other generous sponsors. For a full list, check out our website. In September, we hosted an exclusive Rural Counts webinar series exploring how ARPA impacts our state and contributes to further rural initiatives. The full recording is available via our weekly legislative updates, so be sure you're signed up.
Now, while it was our intention to host a second part of this webinar series once the state budget was passed, we still know that the conference budget remains in negotiation, and so our plans have changed. We are instead presenting to you and providing this exclusive segment about the state budget and the latest and greatest. And sharing that with you today is Tori Keaton, our Policy and Government Affairs Manager. Take it away, Tori.
Hi all, thanks for tuning in. My name is Tori Keaton and I am the Policy and Government Affairs Manager at the NC Rural Center. I wanted to start off today by discussing where we are as of the time of this recording in finalizing a budget for the upcoming fiscal years. So currently the corner offices and the governor are in the midst of negotiations. They're exchanging counter offers back and forth in hopes of getting to a compromise for a conference budget. The main sticking point right now, no surprises, there are things like Medicaid expansion, education funding, things along these lines. I thought it would be helpful to look ahead to consider what we might see when a conference budget passes the state legislature. So what we would be doing is we would be looking at three possible different scenarios. So scenario one is it could be sent over to the governor and we could see Governor Cooper sign it. This would be a first for him. He's never actually signed a budget during his gubernatorial term. There is an alternative to those, though, in which he could let it become law without his signature, meaning he doesn't sign it, he doesn't veto it, he just lets it sit after he's presented with it. And at which point, after the 10th day, it would become law as dictated by the state constitution. Now, there's a lot of factors playing into Cooper's decision, most likely surrounding his priorities being included. It's important to note, though, that he hasn't stated publicly that a single priority is a make or break for him. This differs from 2019, where his signature depended on the inclusion of Medicaid expansion. Now, say the current negotiations, they don't result in a compromise, the governor could veto the budget, and that would bring us to scenario 2 or 3, where the legislator could vote to either overturn the veto and either successfully overturn it or fail to do so. So to overturn a veto, you need 3/5 of the vote in each chamber, so in the House and in the Senate. Thinking about this along party lines, you would need 2 Democrats to join all of the Republicans in the Senate to reach 3/5 of that chamber, and you would need 3 Democrats to join all the Republicans in the House to get 3/5 of that chamber to successfully overturn the veto. And while it might look like we have those numbers, given how many Democrats voted on the individual chamber proposals, votes for proposals don't historically predict votes for a conference budget. There is a lot influencing their vote this go around. It could be the inclusion of funding for projects in their districts or other funding lines. Additionally, there is an election coming up, and that could play a role, given that some legislators may feel that voters would feel more or less inclined to vote for them if there isn't a budget and what is or isn't in that budget. So a lot at play, and it's really hard to say right now that if it were to come to it, if we would have the votes to overturn a veto. If we were to see a vote to overturn a veto and that vote were to fail, we would be in mini budget territory. And that, as of right now, is something we would all like to avoid, because when it comes to mini budgets, there is a higher chance of things being left out that otherwise would have been funded in an omnibus. So we are hoping it doesn't get to that. So all that being said, I'd like to shift to an optimistic viewpoint that we're going to have a budget and kind of move on to discuss how rural issues fared this past session by taking you through the NC Rural Center's 2021 Rural Counts Advocacy Agenda and see how the needle moved within each issue space that you see listed here. We're going to look at what was introduced, what passed a chamber, and what was possibly signed into law. but just with the continued caveat that with the budget not being passed or public right now, we can't say with 100% certainty how this session really wrapped, but this is our best guess as to what's going to happen. So starting with broadband, and we're going to focus on the budget here because most of the standalone bills introduced this session were actually folded into the budget. What we think we're going to see is a massive investment through the American Rescue Plan Act dollars being invested into rural broadband availability. And a lot of that is probably going to be funneled into the established GREAT program, which stands for the Growing Rural Economies with Access to Technology program. What this program does is it issues grants to private internet service providers to deploy broadband services to unserved areas, typically in economically distressed counties. And it's being credited with bringing high-speed internet to thousands of North Carolinians, businesses and farms, and some of the most rural and remote areas of the state. So they're doing really good work, and we are hoping to see them get this funding so that they can continue to do that work. So the remaining funds of that possible up to $964 million, we think it might be able to be used to create and maintain maps that are visualizing broadband distribution and accessibility statewide. What this does is it helps to determine broadband strengths and needs moving forward. So we also think we are going to get some funding for a digital literacy campaign. And what this campaign would do, it would be increasing awareness of community-based efforts and digital literacy offerings. In other words, efforts to educate people so that they're able to utilize the internet to best match their purposes and their needs. Now, oftentimes advocates, when we're talking about broadband and closing the digital divide, we speak about it in terms of three legs of the stool. We talk about accessibility, affordability, and adoption. So far within the budget, we're seeing a lot of accessibility, a little bit of adoption, nothing on affordability. However, we think the federal government might step in here. So right now in DC, there is in the federal bipartisan infrastructure plan, there's a provision for a broadband subsidy for low-income Americans. It's currently caught up in a tug of war in the United States House, but our fingers are crossed that that provision can become law so that it can help an estimated 3.2 million North Carolinians better afford broadband. So all that being said, broadband, it had a good session with affordability, accessibility, and adoption, hopefully all being considered. However, there are some things still left to do. You see here the Fiber Act. This is a bill looking at allowing counties and cities to lease their facilities to internet service providers. And that's just another avenue to increase broadband availability in remote regions. That's something we're hoping to see more movement on in the next session. So moving along into health and what's happening there. Health is taking center stage on budget negotiations and policy news outlets, mostly because of Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion, it has been at the top of our agenda for quite some time. It's been at the top of so many organizations' agendas. As of right now, we are seeing limited expansion for select populations included in the House and the Senate budget proposals. As far as full Medicaid expansion goes, there seems to be more support in the Senate than there is in the House. But we are keeping hope alive that this is finally going to get done so that we can bring affordable, accessible healthcare to thousands of North Carolinians that are currently stuck in the coverage gap. Beyond that, though, in the budget, we're pretty certain that we will see some funding for an incentive program for rural healthcare providers come through. What this program does is it helps these rural healthcare providers pay back their loans if they practice in these more remote regions for a period of time. So it's working as an incentive. You're also thinking that we're going to see some funding for a food accessibility program focusing on locally grown food. This is called the Farm Share program. And lastly, in the budget, we are looking at telehealth. This is a policy piece that was actually folded into the budget or could be folded into the budget. And it is the text of Bill H149. And it's creating some parity provisions for the coverage of telehealth services in certain health insurance plans. Now, telehealth, it's very important to us in terms of expanding healthcare accessibility in rural areas. And of course, we want that care to be affordable and not cost prohibitive. So we are advocating for this to be included in the final budget for sure. Now, looking at bills outside of the budget that were introduced this session for health, lots of pieces looking at expanding access to service through different ways, be it increasing scope of practice, growing practice authority, allowing licenses to practice across state lines. Again, working towards growing people's access to quality services so that they can benefit from the care they need, no matter where they live. And one a little different is the last one here. It is Bill H737. It is a gap certification bill. What this bill would do is expand a cost share program that exists for farmers that are trying to attain what's called the gap certification. This certification, it's needed for them to be able to have their products in certain markets, such as hospitals and schools. It's all about food safety. So it shows their compliance with food safety requirements. However, it's very expensive though. So expanding this cost share program would help more smaller and beginning farmers who might not have the funds to attain the certification, be able to participate and grow their purchasing and retail market and really scale up their business. So looking at our health issues and looking at our agenda next to what's happened and happening, a lot of good work happened, but there's much remains and we're hoping to see the momentum continue into future sessions. So jumping now into housing. So, and primarily looking at the budget, the biggest influx of funding probably is going to happen for the Workforce Housing Loans Program. This loans program, it is administered by the Housing Finance Agency to provide 30-year deferred payment loans at 0% interest to help some of the development costs for affordable housing. And what's interesting with this, though, is that funding, we're expecting a provision to come along with it that it can be used for gap financing of the federal low-income housing tax credits, often abbreviated LIHTC. And what happened here with this gap financing is that there were shortfalls in the tax credit budget because no one really could have accounted for the rise in construction costs that came about as a result of the pandemic. So this gap financing, this funding, it'll kind of help patch that and provide some funds to affordable housing projects that are facing those unexpected price hikes. Unfortunately, we didn't see any increases to other affordable housing programs. And honestly, that is truly disappointing considering the amount of funding that was on the table this go around. But looking at bills, there was one bill introduced that created some state low-income housing tax credits. Didn't get too much traction though. We also did see a bill directing the Legislative Research Commission to conduct a study on the availability of affordable housing in North Carolina and just the persistent issues that are surrounding that. That passed the House, so we will see what happens next session. Overall, though, we got more funding for housing than we've received in the past. Still an uphill battle, though, for these other deserving programs that desperately need more funding. It's a serious issue surrounding accessibility and capacity of affordable housing in the state, one that's been exacerbated by the pandemic. So you can be sure that we will be joining our fellow advocates for this in the years to come. And looking now at water and wastewater. So first, budget. What you're looking at with these expected investments into the water and wastewater grant programs, this is considered historic. This is funding like these programs haven't seen since the Clean Water Bonds. And that's going to be thanks to the American Rescue Plan Act dollars. So if this plan comes through as expected, this is going to be highly impactful to rural communities to ensure our water and wastewater systems can be managed, invested in, and maintained appropriately. We also saw a bill on this front outside of the budget. The long of the short of it is that it's directing for a study that would be looking at implementing some of the pieces that came out of the DEQ State Infrastructure Master Plan that they call the Road to Viability. That is something we at the Rural Center support in our agenda. The plan really works to foster long-term viability of water and wastewater systems by looking at infrastructure, finances, and organizational management. So this study would be a step in the right direction. And finally, looking at our final category of business. So we advocate for small businesses through the North Carolina New Small Business Plan, which organizes policy recommendations into 4 issue areas: funding, support, opportunity, and knowledge. This year, we think we're going to end the session with quite a few successes within each of these issue areas. So to start off with the budget, We are looking at the reauthorization of the next wave of funding for the SSBCI program, which stands for the State Small Business Credit Initiative Program. And we think it's going to be written into the budget that would be administered by the Rural Center. We are also thinking the same will go for capacity building grants for CDFIs, or Community Development Financial Institutions. And CDFIs and SSBCIs, these are programs that allow or help to grow access to capital for small business owners and entrepreneurs when they're looking to establish or grow their business. Oftentimes they have difficulties getting loaned through traditional lenders. So the SSBCI program and CDFIs, they help these businesses get the capital that they need. Additionally, the budget should see the reestablishment of the One North Carolina Small Business Program. This program helps out small businesses that are working on the nation's top research and development priorities, apply for some very highly competitive federal grants. And we also think we're going to see some funding for small businesses that suffered economic damages from the COVID-19 pandemic through the Retool program that is administered through the Hub office, and also a separate grant program. Now, the separate grant program, they were different in the House and the Senate as far as final details, who was eligible, et cetera. We will be sure to report back once we see these programs, their final details, and we'll say what they stipulate. So we'll get back to that one once the details come out. But additionally, we will also see some substantial funding for rural downtown areas through the transformation grants. That is going to be helping revitalize these communities so that they can show off the best that they have to offer. And finally, funding to market the CTE programs, and also to provide CTE options for students outside of the classroom settings that can be offered during the times of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot was happening in the budget. You can see there were a few standalone bills that I wanted to mention. As you can see, the regulatory sandbox bill passed. So some financial innovation products, they can be tested out on the market without as many constraints, but still preserving those very important protections for consumers. And finally, the very last bill of the session to be introduced was the Truth in Financing Act, TIFA. So what this is doing is it's creating disclosure requirements for non-bank commercial lenders. So basically, when small business owners are shopping for a loan within non-bank commercial lending spaces, they can be aware of the costs associated with the loans that they're looking at upfront and compare the different loan options so that they can make the most informed choice for their business. So considering what we set out to do with our North Carolina new small business plan and the Rural Counts Advocacy Agenda, we saw some really good movement and wins within each of our issue areas. We think it's going to be a very successful and fruitful session for rural North Carolina, but of course, there is still much to do. And we will continue our advocacy for the rural communities in our sessions to come. But that wraps up our policy agenda. I did want to take a moment to mention these different ways to be involved in the work of the Rural Center. We are asking small businesses and entrepreneurs and supporters of small businesses to sign up for our Small Business Coalition. If you would like to receive news and updates on our small business agenda. We also invite everyone to join our Rural Counts Advocacy Network for news and updates related to all the advocacy priorities and issues you just heard about. And of course, to sign up for the Rural Center's general newsletter to keep up to date on all things rural. And last but not least, of course, save the date for our upcoming Rural Summit. We would love to see you in person at the Raleigh Hilton on March 21st and the 22nd. And so with that, I thank you so much for listening. And on behalf of the entire Rural Center, thank you for your continued dedication and support of rural North Carolina.